Right, let's start. We've got quite a few people on the call already. So welcome everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar, new CloudFest webinar. We'll talk about how we can help you halve your costs in using FinOps and Azure Cost Management. We'll go through a quick intro and then we'll move on to our agenda for today. So my name is Luis Aguirre. I'm a principal consultant at Contino. I'm a FinOps certified practitioner and also certified in Microsoft Azure. Viral, over to you.
Thank you, Louis. Good morning or good afternoon, depending where you are in the world. I'm Viral. I'm a senior consultant at Contino. I help customers on their cloud adoption journey within Azure. Worked in all types of industries, bringing DevOps transformation into working practices, and recently helping clients on achieving FinOps excellence within Azure. We have Gerardo from Microsoft.
Thank you. My name is Gerardo Maya. I'm an executive digital advisor at Microsoft, part of the Microsoft Consulting Services Group. And my main focus is running programs of transformation and digital enablement, and specifically finding avenues of value and optimization, including financial and costing. So happy to be here and share some of what Microsoft is doing on the financial side.
Thank you, guys. So a little bit about Contino. Most of you will have heard of us or worked with us, hopefully. Contino is a leading transformation consultancy focusing on highly regulated enterprises, generally focusing on cloud and DevOps adoption and transformation. We've worked across a large number of customers. We've got a global presence, and we're currently staffed and powered by over 360 people globally. If you could move on to the next slide, please, Rob. So Contino is a Microsoft Gold partner. As you can see here, we've got several competencies and many more on the way. So we have worked with Microsoft to be a CAF Ready program partner and also a Azure migration program partner. And we're also partners of the FinOps Foundation, as well as certified service providers and training providers for the FinOps Foundation. So moving on to the agenda slide. So I'll cover a brief introduction on FinOps, what it is, why we're here, basically. I'll hand over to Gerardo, where he'll cover how we can do FinOps in Azure, what services are available, and how to leverage them. We'll then show you how we help the customers save 50% on their bill. And lastly, we'll cover what you should be doing to achieve FinOps excellence. So starting with FinOps. So for those who don't know, FinOps is a practice by which we bring together finance, technology, and business, as well as procurement, to provide a full understanding and consistent processes to managing costs in the cloud. A bit like DevOps and SRE have done for engineering, we're doing that to applying that to cost management in the cloud. I'd encourage you to check out the latest content on our website. There was a new blog post that went live earlier today, which describes this in a lot more detail. Covering on the next slide, a bit of the value that we're trying to bring with FinOps. So we want to provide traceability of decisions and also information to make those. So we purchasing a 2-year subscription, a 3-year subscription. Why are we doing that? And providing the data to do that is very important. Also empowering the teams to make the most out of cloud within the guardrails that are set, where we set certain services that they're allowed to use, that we know that they're not going to spend a lot of money, or they'll spend within the controls that we've provided them. Also bring across collaboration, as we mentioned earlier, finance, procurement, and technology. This is very important. Everyone can speak the same language. We all understand why we're doing it and where we're trying to get to. And also very important, optimize spend, which is ultimately what this is about, optimize spend. It's not necessarily trying to save money, but it's getting the most for all your pounds, dollars of your local currency so that you can make the most out of the cloud. Move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So many of the questions we're trying to answer in this process is these ones you can see on the screen. Everyone is asked these questions by exec, by finance. Why have we spent more this month in cloud? Why have we spent less? Generally, why have we spent more? What's our forecast? What are we going to spend for the next year, 2 years, 3 years? This is very hard to do without the correct practices, without understanding our workloads, and we'll cover a bit more on that further on in this presentation. Also, do we know which applications, which services, which business units are spending the most in cloud? We want to be able to share that back to the business and the people who want to know those answers. Jeroen, if you could move on to the next slide. Thank you. Lastly, on the intro to FinOps. So FinOps isn't a one-off event. We don't run a FinOps process once. Again, a bit like DevOps and SRE, it is an ongoing practice. We should be doing this every day, all the time. It should be part of what we are. So it's continuous management and improvement lifecycle. We need to understand our workloads, we right size, we show back, and we keep on doing that iteratively. It never finishes, but it will bring massive value to organizations. I'll hand over to Gerard now to take us through how we do this all in Azure.
Thank you, Louis. And I think the best way to start framing how Azure can actually help you with your financial optimization and how FinOps fits in the Azure practice, it's important to consider that there's now many different groups that actually are involved in the way Azure is being used and how Azure operates. So that's very important to consider because it just takes one person to spin one virtual machine to actually change the whole cost perspective in a couple of days. So it's really important to have an overview or the holistic view on how do we best manage this. And I think from a perspective of Azure, Azure has many tools to help you along the way in this cost effectiveness, but we also acknowledge that it's not cost in isolation. It's a combination of factors that really work together to make this the best efficient way to use Azure. And that's why we rely a lot on what we call the cloud adoption framework. And if you notice in the agenda, we make two distinctions, right? There's a cloud adoption framework, which is our core framework to really not only drive, but strategize, define, adopt, and use Azure as your public cloud, and cost efficiencies comes there. And I'll show you specifically where FinOps plays a role. You'll also hear language around the Azure well-architected framework, which basically they're complementary. The Azure Cloud Adoption Framework covers the entirety of your Azure strategy, while the Azure Well-Architected Framework is built for analyzing one specific workload if that's what you need. So if you're in a specific situation where you need to analyze one workload and double click on that lens, the Azure Well-Architected Framework will help you, but really what set up the practices across your Cloud Center of Excellence or your cloud practice should be driven by the Cloud Adoption Framework. So just want to give that initial context, and you will see where that benefits. And then I think the other piece that is very important in the way we design the Azure governance or the adoption framework specifically is we want Azure to adapt to your current needs. We want to meet you where you are instead of you have to go through a series of changes to adapt to a framework that we define. So you'll notice that as we go through the presentation. This is in a nutshell what the Cloud Adoption Framework is. For the perspective of FinOps, we're going to actually double down on the govern component. But this shows you how the Cloud Adoption Framework can help you from defining your strategy, whether it's your only like public cloud only strategy, hybrid strategy. How do you really want to drive your public cloud adoption or your Azure adoption specifically? But in this case, from the FinOps perspective and the financial optimization and cost management, it's really in the govern component where we highlight most of those different elements. So you see it's not called out specifically in the categories, but as we delve into it, you'll notice where the cost components come in. But it's also important for us to highlight that Azure sees this in a very modular way. So you see how cost management influences policy and influence other elements inside the Azure governance ecosystem. So you need to keep those in mind. But it actually, they complement each other, and they're by design made in such a modular way that it allows you to have freedom on how do you want to manage Azure, whether with our native tools or also connect and augment with other third-party tools. So you will see how that works specifically in the context of FinOps. Let me to the next slide. Try it one more time. Okay, so let's go specifically to the services and tools. What do you see from a perspective of a FinOps strategy that really will help you, considering what Louis just explained around the FinOps components? Pardon me here, I'm having some challenge moving the slide. Try again here. Okay. There we go. So one thing that you will notice, and this is amplifying from the cloud adoption framework, is really cost management is one of the components of the governance piece. But what you see in the bubbles that encompass each one of the different components in governance, which is beyond just cost, right? Security, resource consistency, policy. A lot of these services and a lot of the tools that we use in Azure for cost management, they're also used in other elements of governance. And as I mentioned, it's important to have that distinction because we want to keep, for example, the Azure policy service as a way for you to define your policies, whether you're coming from a mindset of authentication, identity, and subscription control. So you can set up policies that way, tagging and resource management as well, but they all complement each other. So although you see on the left side that cost management, that we actually have a cost management called Azure Cost Management module or service, they actually work really well together with other elements of the Azure ecosystem, like Azure Advisor, if you have seen it before. I'll highlight the pieces that are cost management, but Azure Advisor goes beyond cost. It's trying to understand your patterns of consumption, your usage, but it all complements with each other. And what it's important for us for having that modularity of tools is we let its service or tool do its own thing really well, and then we collectively, if you have seen the analogy we use in other elements, but our integration frameworks are very solid, but also the graph component on how we integrate the data between all of these different services is really when we start seeing the recommendations or the right enablement to proceed. So if I double down on cost management, you see blueprints, for example, which is a way to deploy not only specific workloads, but complete environments that are already defined under specific policies, under specific restrictions of access or identity that is defined, tagging that is predefined. So you see how even a service like Azure Blueprint, it's really an enabler of your FinOps practice. It's really an enabler of what you will see in cost management. So they're all interrelated and they work with each other. So keep that in mind. We'll double down on cost management and Azure Advisor for this webinar specifically. So we show you how that aligns to FinOps practices, but keep in mind that there's a whole gambit of services in Azure that really complements each other. So it's not about cost management doesn't have this element of tagging that I need to tap on from a FinOps lens, but you have to go to the resource management, the resource grouping and tagging to complement that. And it's meant to be that way. So you have that modularity and assign roles and responsibilities as you consider. But then in this case, we're seeing it from one lens, but it could actually evolve into different pieces. And that's what makes Azure very strong in that perspective. At the end of the day, you see here how we summarize the governance, and definitely cost management. It's a key one. And you see at the bottom what are the key drivers for each one of these different elements of governance. So for example, from resource graph, as I mentioned before, is basically visibility. So resource graph is responsible of the data that is being collected. And what is powerful about it is we're collecting data from utilization perspective. So how a specific resource is being used, and then that overlays with the consumption as the core measurement for cost management. But there's other ways for us to complement policy. It's focused on control, and then they interrelate with each other. Cost management, we're going to be that will be our area of focus, but it's important for you to see how they interrelate with each other, and that visibility gives us also consistency. So you will, when you get a result from your cost management perspective on the usage, or let's say the cost or the billing of a specific resource, it matches directly with the actual utilization analysis. So there's no breakage in the data. It's just a consolidation of data, and the actual focus or views are shown based on what do you want to see: consumption cost, or billing and costing versus visibility, your environment, hierarchy, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this is what is important to highlight from that perspective. Now let's see how we can leverage Azure to achieve that service excellence. So we until this point, we're still seeing governance, right? Cloud adoption framework, governance component, and then how governance component include cost, but also other elements such as policy, resource management, et cetera. But really, when we focus on the achievement of FinOps excellence, there's great services and great components that can help you in your journey. I'll start talking a bit about in the initial leg of your journey, where you are. And for the where you are question, we have a series of Azure assessments that are aligned to the frameworks that we earlier discussed. So I'll show you a little bit of how that looks like. But if you don't know, if you're in this FinOps journey, you know you want to optimize utilization, you know you want to save some money, but where do you start? You don't know exactly where to start. The Azure assessment will help you at least get an initial perspective on how your workload is behaving, how your cloud infrastructure is behaving, and then give you some pointers on where to actually start. Second one would be the Azure Advisor. Azure Advisor is a very powerful tool, mainly because it's one of our services that runs with machine learning on the back, analyzing behaviors and patterns from your resource usage and coming up with suggestions on how you should improve or optimize your Azure infrastructure. Cost optimization is part of that Azure Advisor component. And one thing that I always explain to my customers is Azure Advisor and the way the engine works in giving suggestions, it's even the same engine. Like if I'm a customer-facing role, so if I work with customers internally from a Microsoft perspective, when I analyze consumption patterns and I want to give my customer a good perspective, I get the same advisory as well. So it's the same engine that runs, and you will get the benefit. It's just a matter of deciding where do you want to start, how do you want to tackle it. But they are always, Azure Advisor it's a leading service, continuously understanding how do you use the specific services. There's nothing that you need to do to enable Azure Advisor. As soon as you start consuming the right resources, or the resources where there's patterns and there's algorithms to understand utilization and optimization, you'll start getting those reflected in your Azure portal. And then the last one, the Azure Cost Management, last but not least, where you will see more specifics and drill down on what Azure Cost Management is doing to help you improve your financial optimization, or in this case, your FinOps excellence. So let me start with Azure assessments. So for the Azure assessment perspective, there's a couple of tools that you can use. So one that you can find, and this is all available in the Azure documentation or in the Azure portal, is the governance benchmark tool. Governance benchmark tool is directly associated with the cloud adoption framework. And it's basically a series of questions that it will ask you based on your current state. And it covers more than just the technical aspects of Azure. It will ask you questions around process. It will ask you questions about people and organization. And even sometimes the governance benchmark covers the entire CAF scope. So wanted to give you kind of that heads up, but it allows you to improve your cloud practice entirely or your cloud governance entirely, but you can also drill down to cost if that's where you want to focus on. And what you see on the left is then kind of the forms that you fill out, but also on the right side, one thing that this governance benchmark tool gives you, and hence the benchmark name, it gives you also a high-level view on how do you match based on your industry. So part of the information that you put inside is what industry you are in, and it gives you just an aggregate view on how are you ranking, how are you scoring compared to other peers in your same industry. It doesn't go to detail to tell you which peers, but at an industry level, it tells you here's how you benchmark compared to your industry, and that helps you from a FinOps perspective give your teams, whether it's procurement, whether it's engineering, basically a North Star or a baseline on where do we see the industry going? Where do we see investments in public cloud, and in this case in Azure going? So it's a good tool to start. And this is just what you see in this case is for the Azure well-architected view. Both give you the same type of results. Azure well-architected framework, as I mentioned, is focused on one specific workload. So in the case that you want to double down on one specific, you can actually do the same. It's very similar to CAF. I would say it's complementary, covers all the governance aspects. I'm just highlighting on the screen right now the results focus on cost. And you see that's why the not assessed pieces are showing for operational excellence, performance, reliability, security. I still encourage you to do that, but it will give you a sense of where you are in a metric based on best practices. But more importantly, it also gives you some recommendations on how can you start improving your workload. So how is it helpful? And if you ask, where do I use one or the other? CAF should always be your guiding principle for your entire cloud or Azure practice. Azure well-architected framework can help you double down on one workload if you need to understand specific patterns on one specific workload or environment that you're seeing that is probably deviating from your policy or deviating from your cost numbers. So that's where the utility comes from each one of those. But they're complementary. So you will see a lot of consistency coming from both of them. Azure Advisor. Let's talk a little bit about Azure Advisor. And for me, Azure Advisor it's my favorite. And with our Contino partners, we share the same sentiment. It's really a great accelerator. And what I love to always say is a good time to value. Also, when you start seeing workloads being used by your teams, and you start from a FinOps perspective, and you say, okay, I have a perspective from the assessments on where should I be. Now where do I start, right? Azure in itself is a universe of resources. So where do I start? Where do I actually start working on efficiencies? So what you start seeing in this slide is just literally recommendations that could pop up. And I say could because it depends on the workload. So it's not just an advisor, I'll call it. It's not a dumb system that is just giving you advice for the sake of advice, but it's really connected and learning from your usage. What is the best optimization to show you? So I'm highlighting some of the ones that are focused specifically on cost, right? So you see some like reduce cost by eliminating unprovisioned express route circuits. One of the, I would say personally, what I experience with a lot of customers is the usage of storage and virtual machines need some discipline to hone, right? Like you start thinking, normally teams start thinking on the production environment, and you start using like high tiers of storage. And that makes sense, right? At the beginning to think about production. But then in dev environments, it doesn't necessarily need to live like a tier one high SLA storage. Shouldn't be part of that on a daily basis running 24/7. It should run when it needs to be run, but Azure Advisor will start calling out some of those. And I'll highlight a couple of more, but one thing to highlight is it not only gives you advice from an infrastructure as a service perspective. It gives you tips on also platform as a service. Any of the PaaS that is being used, it also gives you tips on right sizing. What's the best way to right size your databases? It starts seeing those behaviors and give you really good advice on where to start. So, and even to services at the bottom right, such as Synapse, which they are really new services in Azure, there's already a correlation there on how do you best use it, how do you leverage Azure Advisor. So my recommendation for Azure Advisor is if you right now don't know where to start, you want to start from a FinOps perspective, showing value as a FinOps practitioner, take a look at this. If your customer, your company is running Azure for quite some time, Azure Advisor already should have some of the suggestions available, even beyond cost, right? We talk about operational security and other elements. Security is a key area we also recommend, but keep in mind that you can find specific cost advisory, and that's where you can start. And you will see that the time to value is really effective, because these are current and real scenarios that Azure has identified where you can definitely save and optimize the usage in Azure. So keep those in mind. Always take a look at advisory. I think the key message, if you want to take one message from this slide, is it's not ad hoc message. It's tailored to your consumption and the usage that you're actually putting to in Azure. And then, of course, being this conversation around FinOps, let's discuss what Azure Cost Management component is. So again, it's one of the many components in governance. But if you see now, if we take the three-step journey of excellence, we know where we are now with assessments. We are now relying on the capabilities of automation and machine learning to give us the first set of initiatives that we need to focus on very tactically to start showing value around FinOps. Now we delve on the Azure Cost Management piece to get the best out of the whole concept, or out of the whole cost management practice. One thing that you will see from Azure Cost Management is that it's focused on three main areas. How do you monitor your cloud spend? Who's accountable for your cloud spend? For me, accountability is the most powerful word in FinOps. And then how do you optimize? But also it complements really well on how it's focused organizationally. So you see on the left side, it's focused on management teams. So it gives management a view on how do you work, how are you performing, and what are the patterns that you are seeing in the overarching use of Azure. Finance teams that need to know exactly what's the behavior from a financial lens perspective. And then application teams, which are the engineering teams that are making things happen. And they all play a role. And that has been surfaced as well in the FinOps definitions and guiding principles. This is the definition that you need to see: how finance influence cost, how engineering teams influence cost, and how it's more of a distributed responsibility, but they all play a role in that optimization. So from a FinOps perspective, we know from the guiding principles that that's the recommendation, and Azure will complement that. And how you see that is, if you see again kind of the wheel of Azure Cost Management, it completely aligns with what Louis was mentioning from the continuous cost optimization process of FinOps. It basically follows the same concept, informed with monitoring, optimizing, and then operations. We call out the accountability piece really at the highest level, because that's when we see the biggest change, not only from a policy perspective, from a cost perspective, but also from a behavior perspective in the usage of cloud. Its accountability really drives the culture of optimization, whether you want to see it financially, you want to see it from efficiency, you want to see it from speed to innovation. It's all based on accountability. Out of the three elements I highlighted, I wanted to highlight just one, which is the drive organizational accountability. Again, for me, is one of the key or the most important one. But that's where Azure Cost Management gives you the ability to create budgets and alerts based on specific organizational levels. How do you let teams access data and insights based on role-based access controls, which is also really interesting. It's also how do you let teams, for example, how do you let engineering teams see the efficiency through not necessarily the cost? Maybe that's not an incentive from an engineering team. Engineering teams are more focused on speed of innovation, the usage of resources. So for the engineering teams, the lens that you want to show is basically consumption units, optimization, and efficient. How do you tell, and having an engineering background, how do you tell an engineer that they're more efficient, they're optimizing, and they're really doing their best? From that perspective, really instills a lot of change in their behavior. Whether in finance is probably the dollar figure that needs that is the incentive. So keep those in mind. And then automatically alerting, right? So, like Azure will not, or even Azure Cost Management will never stop anyone from using Azure, unless from a policy perspective you restrict that. But it could also create alerts to stakeholders based on thresholds. How are you doing if there's an anomaly, or even how do you learn to understand what's an anomaly and what's not? I just had a few days a conversation with a customer in which we were discussing a little peak of increase. The customer basically averaged $75,000 a day in Azure, and they were concerned about a peak. But guess what, right? Between September and October is 31 days in the month. September is 30 days. That's where the fluctuation actually happen, and we will easily prove that through the cost management tool. So how do you understand that those are not alerts, but they're expected behaviors from your practice? And those are calendar behaviors, but also you can start identifying patterns in your organization that are normal patterns, like peak times or expected consumption patterns, and then you can focus on the ones that really will drive and change and optimize your financials. So keep those in mind. One important aspect for us at Microsoft and in Azure is to offer customers the option to leverage our services in the way that they feel it's the best way to use it. So what you see really in this progression bar is, I've been talking a lot about Azure Cost Management in the Azure portal. That's your immediate gateway to start leveraging some of those benefits. You really want to focus on cost, you go there, you leverage that. But also, we know that our native tools will serve a specific purpose, ready to use initially in your journey, and then things will get sophisticated. So there's two ways that we can help with that, and it's a dialogue with our customers. And I'll show you then in the future of cost management how you can contribute to that future. But also, we enable connectors to Power BI when we know customers need additional information, or you start tailoring your graphs and your consumption to something that really aligns to your practice, to your line of business way of seeing data. You can do that with connectors and Power BI, or you can really go to a level where we give you access to the Azure API. So cost management also is part of that Azure API, where you can just connect directly and leverage the information that comes out of cost management and use it as you see fit. So I think the point here is, if you need readiness, you're ready to go, you can start with the Azure portal. But then as you mature in your practice, you can basically define your own ways to use it and basically tap into the information. But the information is there. Very important, the information is yours. We don't see the details of consumption. We can see patterns of how services are being used, hence what you see in Azure Advisor. But the real detail and how you tag, how you do policy, that's yours. And we take that privacy really seriously, but we also give you the tools to leverage it if that's what you want. And that complements specifically with that integration. So as I mentioned, as a way to start wrapping that conversation from CAF, you could see cost management as a module that integrates and integrates and collaborates with other areas in Azure. So Azure Cost Management feeds Azure Advisor. Why? Because Azure Advisor looks for security advisory, for optimization advisory, operational excellence, and cost. But the value there, the key value for that is that we can also correlate operations with cost, finance with utilization. So it's a very powerful way, but this is how you should see the world of Azure from a governance perspective. And that's why I gave you that governance lens, is you need to see cost management as a way to how do cost management integrates with the rest of the elements that you see in Azure. So sometimes if you feel that cost management is not giving you what you need, take a look at how Azure Cost Management works plus action groups, plus ARM, plus policy. And that's where you will see that the capability is already there. I'll wrap it up and pass it on back to my Contino friends, but just saying from a roadmap perspective, there's two things that I'll encourage you. One is you can be part of the roadmap. I know if you go to Azure updates, you will see what's coming from Azure Cost Management. You can double down, and if you see at the bottom, there's I think the Twitter feed specifically from Azure Cost Management is a really good way also to understand what's coming. But what I will encourage you today is to leverage the service that we have called Cost Management Labs. Cost Management Labs is the ability for you to enable specific capabilities for cost management that are not in general availability, but you decide to leverage them and use them. But most importantly is we not only want your feedback on capabilities that we release, but you can suggest new capabilities that needs to be added to that cost management piece. And that's really where we as Azure will thrive more, is to listen. And it has brought already so many great features that we're incorporating in Azure Cost Management. A really recent one is like, how do we share the cost among resources that are being used by multiple environments? There's a capability now for that and came through Cost Management Labs. So I'll encourage you to sign up to Cost Management Labs. You can go directly, you can just go through your search engine, look for it. And if you have your Azure portal open, it will point you directly there where you can decide what are the things very similar to insider programs. What do you want to be part of? How do you want to collaborate? And the more you use it, the more you learn not only what's coming, but also leverage the power of you influencing what will come out of cost management. So with that, I'll leave you with that thought. Be part of what cost management will be in the future, and I hope that this sharing have helped you at least give you the baseline or also the different pieces that you need for achieving FinOps excellence in Azure. Back to you, Beryl.
Thank you, Gerardo. That was brilliant. So the next part will be how Contino help cut cloud costs for a customer by 50%. So the challenge was this customer was new to their Azure cloud journey. They soon realized their cloud spend was exceeding vastly. So Contino took an approach to provide a full-week Azure cost optimization assessment. Now, throughout the 4-week assessment, the cost management report was done through the Azure cost management lens, exactly what Gerardo alluded to. But this gave us a real insight into their resources and the costs that were incurring. This also gave us an indication into their development working practices in terms of workloads and the infrastructure that was being provisioned. The Azure cost management forecasting was another great tool to show back to the client what their forecast was going to look like come the end of the year, as their spend month by month was increasing at exponential rates. So the assessment was carried in 5 phases, which were how is your resource currently being used, monitoring the cloud spend, efficient as your resource placement, tactical changes to address the operational cloud spend, and strategic changes to address the cloud spend. And I'll go into more detail on what each phase and what that entailed. So within the Azure cost management, we were able to drill down to the high cost workloads. And from there, we were able to assess the utilization of the resources. A lot of the workloads, the utilization was very minimal. And in some instances, development teams were provisioning premium tier databases. And at times, once they were no longer required, they were not being removed at all. We found development virtual machines running 24/7, replicating data center patterns. No shutdown schedules were put in place. We found incorrect size of workloads, which were incurring significant costs as well. Now, to help monitor the cloud spend, we recommended the non-production environment to run within dev test assigned subscriptions. Now, running in dev test subscriptions is only for development purposes. You have no sort of SLA, but it opens up a plethora of opportunities for cost reduction. Now, for example, Windows virtual machines are built at Linux rates. You find Azure SQL, you'll receive up to about 55% reduced cost rates. Now, with the client going through an application re-architect, we recommended looking at 1 year reserved instances for Azure SQL to help reduce their monthly spend from 20 to 70%. Also looking to implement Azure policy and look to restrict resource sizing. As we saw on many occasions, a lot of the development teams provision high premium tier databases, and looking at the resource utilization was minimal or no usage at all. And on many instances, we found once the database were no longer required, they weren't being removed. Now, we quickly found if leaving these largely unused premium tier databases, this would have equated to an annual cost of $400,000 US. So by restricting the resource size, the developers can provision on approved sizing that fit for the development purposes. Changing mindset was required where the team would have probably been used to the traditional CapEx model and needs to start shifting to the OpEx on-demand pay-as-you-go services. Now, many of the workloads were incorrectly provisioned. We found many instances databases provisioned in premium tier where standard tier would have been sufficient to run the workload and will help reduce the monthly cost. Also, as I mentioned, many of the virtual machines run in idle 24/7 when not in use. This would have been a great example where you run minimum size resources and you scaling sets when there is high demand. This would ensure that you're only paying for high demand resources when required. Moving workloads that run in traditional services to cloud native will be more efficient, so leveraging things like Azure web apps or containerization. We quickly found by leveraging infrastructure as code using better working practices, switching off and downsizing during weekends, 30% per calendar month savings could be made. 15% per calendar month could be saved by scaling down Azure SQL. Shutting down development virtual machines outside business hours would help save another 10% per calendar month. So the final stage of this session was we were able to help the client to capitalize on better working practices as they continue down their cloud journey. We investigated further possible spend reduction using longer pre-term purchasing of infrastructure and help showcase business advantages on what automation can provide. Size estimate for production workloads to enable most efficient long-term spend reductions using, for example, vehicle reserved instances. Now, all the databases were provisioned as DTU model. Microsoft recommends general rule of thumb, every 100 DTUs in a basic or standard tiers require at least one vehicle, and every 125 DTUs in the premium tier, at least one vehicle. Now, automation and scaling will offer another 30% cost savings for non-production workloads, along with good working practice to downsize, switch off during the weekend. Purchasing the dev test subscriptions, Azure SQL databases on a vehicle model can save up to 66% spend compared to a stock equivalent of SQL DTU. Also, using 1 year reserved instances alongside the dev test subscription pricing can save 40% on standard vehicle model pay-as-you-go spend. So with the automation we put in place, programmatically scaling down the SQL service for their non-production environments, automating shutdown of virtual machines during the weekend, this resulted in $45,000 savings per calendar month, which equated to nearly $500,000 savings a year. Now, the savings Contino were able to make for the client was a massive step for the client to help reduce their cloud spend and provide better cloud maturity within Azure. So I will now hand over to Louis, who will talk about FinOps excellence in Azure.
Thank you very much, Vero. If you could move to the next slide, please. So in the last few minutes that we have of your time, quickly cover maturity framework and also what the next steps are that you should be carrying out. So this maturity framework is based on the one from the FinOps Foundation. Gives you an idea of all the different stages you should go through to achieve a good maturity level across the different pillars that you can see there. I'll just pick out a few. So for example, under the understanding fully loaded costs, there's so many dashboards, as Gerard already covered, built into Azure Cost Management. Use those dashboards. There's a lot of data in there. If necessary, pull it in Power BI. But that is a very, very powerful tool. Tagging resources is very important. So make sure all, if not most of your resources are tagged. Set tagging KPIs if required for all the different teams. You might find that one team tags more resources than others. So if you set KPIs, make it fun, gamify it, whatever will work. That can be also very powerful. Once you've got that, you can set budgets per team, per workload, and so on. Azure budgets, as I said, take that back to the teams, make sure that they're not overspending to what their committed budget is. Azure Advisor, as Gerard covered, also a very powerful tool, lots of recommendations, many times lots of quick recommendations. You can achieve sometimes quick savings just by executing on some of those advisor items. Some of them even come with a button that will do it for you if you're lucky. So do use it. Next, around saving money. So ultimately, so if you resize workloads, there'll be workloads that you have running that are overspec'd because something was going on at some point. There was an issue in production. You've overspec'd the databases just to get through a performance issue, and that probably never came back down. And also reserved instances is also a good way of saving money, as we're also covered. If you can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So covering now just around people, process, and technology, what are the immediate things that we recommend you look at that are within your power? And probably some of them you're already doing. Understanding your workloads. There will be people in the teams that understand the workloads. Finance on their own won't know what the workloads are. So working with the teams of people who know what's running, that is very important. Again, the data, the dashboards, it's all there, make use of it. And ultimately, once you've got that data, it's tagged and it's assigned to teams, that will make them care naturally. You know, you can compete, figure out which team is saving more money than others. Again, set a little competition going, and ultimately drive accountability into the teams for the money that they're spending. Next slide, please. Cheers. So in terms of processes, budgets, we already covered. Tagging, turn stuff off. It seems like a logical thing to do, but we do find in many customers, if not all customers, there's stuff running that, oh yeah, we'll turn that off one day, or someone's put up a couple of machines just to test something in dev and it never got shut down again. So turn stuff off, it will save you money. Lastly, the other very important one is once all the tagging is in place and the dashboards and so on, you can actually show back or charge back if you wish to. So if you want to do financial cross-charging in case of big enterprises, that data needs to be there. It needs to be tagged. Only then can you show back or charge back. Lastly, technology. Beryl, if you could move on to the next slide. Just almost as a summary of key things that Gerardo mentioned. Azure policy, use Azure policy. You can set budgets, you can set resource types, resource sizes, and so on. Make sure that people comply with the reserved instances that you've purchased centrally. So you're not buying 10 types of virtual machine. You might find that you end up using different sizes and you're not fully consuming your reservations. Azure Advisor, again, very important. Use it. It's there, it's free, and it will save you money. Reserved instances and also spot instances, which is something fairly new for Microsoft, which is these virtual machines that live only for a limited time, but they are very cheap compared to all other resources. Automatic scaling, again, that's a feature built into Azure. If your workload supports it, use auto scaling. The more load a platform has, it can scale up, but more importantly, it will scale back down, and so much more. There is so much built into Azure right now to help everyone with this. Use it, please use it. On that note, if you can move on to the next slide, Viral, that concludes the content for this webinar. We've probably got 2 or 3 minutes for some questions if there are any. Viral, could you check for us?
Yes. So
as Viral does, if you could just go back on the slide. Just on the previous slide. So we'll have another webinar on the 16th of November to talk about how CIOs are preparing for the new normal now with the pandemic. We'll be joined by the CIOs from Home Credit and Finance Bank, and also the HI group, where they'll discuss what their views are in 2021 and what it will mean for their organizations.
Brilliant. Thank you, Louis.
Bill, did we have a few questions?
Yes. So a couple of questions. So are we going to get a copy of the slides after the session? So yes, as you signed up to the webinar, you will get a link to once it's for the recording. So you'll be able to play back for the recording. So look out for that. It'll be emailed straight to your mailbox. No other questions. If anyone does have questions, feel free to type them away. We can see if we can answer them.
A couple more minutes.
Yep, got a couple of more minutes.
If not, we thank everyone for their time. Have a wonderful afternoon, if for those who aren't staying on. Yeah,
so I think we've got one question. Thank you for the presentation. Can you explain more about the dev test or subscription within Azure? So yeah, so if you look at the Microsoft Azure's offerings, they for development purposes are only that have a dev test subscriptions. Now within there, you don't have any sort of SLAs. But what you do have is reduced costs. So like I mentioned, virtual machines are reduced cost, and they're kind of based on sort of your Linux rates. There are other, SQL servers that are 55% reduced cost rates, up to 55%. But there are other, from logic apps to other resources within there that give you an opportunity to, while you're developing, trying out those resources and those workloads at reduced rates. Gerardo, is there anything else you want to add to that?
No, that's totally spot on. But what I will add is also in the case that you already have set up development environments outside that type of service or that type of environment, you should also start considering different policies like freeze management, or at least shut down dev environments before you go over the weekend. Like really simple things that really change the way you see it. Is more thinking outside the traditional infrastructure mindset, and now think, well, how can I basically do this? And even internally at Microsoft, our own developers have specific policies where we even shut down at the end of the day some resources, or if there's no activity, like you can actually leverage that, or leverage the dev test environments, which already have a lot of benefits embedded in them.
Thank you, Gerardo. Right, I think, Gerardo, maybe you could want, so last one, is there any process to follow for initial cloud sizing?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it could be taken in 2 different ways, right? So for cloud sizing, and normally I would say depends on the workload. So that's why we sometimes make emphasis on some specific workloads. And what we have seen is if you are doing some of the migration, let's say you're coming from a data center, you should have a visual of how is the performance of that workload. One area that we recommend to customers sometimes is to redirect some of the logs from the data center to Azure, so you start getting some analytics there. And then once you move the workload, you start seeing how the behavior match. It might, in some cases, what I've seen is different perspectives. One, you can move like for like. One, you can, sometimes you need to augment a little bit of resources just to see how the workload behaves. But I think the most important aspect of that right sizing is when you move the workload from a different source, let's say data center or another public cloud, to Azure, that's the beginning of your journey. So now you need to pay attention to monitoring, optimizations, what your database is behaving, and after a few iterations, you start finding the right sizing. What I would say is sometimes it depends on what FinOps call the iron triangle, right? Are you focused on velocity? Are you focused on quality? Are you focused on cost? And based on that, you make decisions. How do you want to migrate the workload? I think that the best advice I could give is it's a continuous exercise or discipline, not just a one-time thing.
Thank you, Gerardo.
Yeah, and just to build on that, right? We, as Contino, we have helped many customers lift and shift. We do understand how to go through that process, and we'd be happy to help anyone with that. On that note, I think our time is up. So I'd like to say thank you to everyone who joined. Thank you to Vero, Gerardo. Thank you to Microsoft for lending us your time. Much appreciated. And yeah, have a great afternoon, everyone.
Brilliant.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you, everybody. And stay safe. Bye-bye.